Good evening, everybody. I'm glad so many of you showed up. My name is Max, and as you can see, our presentation is already up there, and I will shortly hand over to our main speaker of tonight. But before, I would like to say a few words about our organization. We are ICER, which stands for International Center for Eastern Europe Research. I myself have been part of this organization for 8 years now. We are an independent, nonpartisan think tank specializing in political and economic analysis with a focus on Eastern Europe, as you might have guessed from our name. We conduct masterclasses and seminars open to the public, as well as less public bilateral or trilateral meetings in cooperation with Austrian government agencies. These meetings focus on the support of various civil society initiatives in Eastern Europe, on the mediation between conflict parties, and the exchange of vital information. All of these activities are made possible through our extensive network of experts. Over the last 3 years, in the wake of rapidly shifting political landscape, we were reminded of the importance of good political forecasting. Thus, we decided to put our aforementioned network of experts to use and launch a school, the ICER School of Political Forecasting. While the first semester has recently come to an end, we've already put together the next one, but more on that later. And I have with me here tonight Mr. Andrew Wilson, who is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, amongst many other things, and most of all, an expert on Eastern Europe and especially Ukraine, which will be tonight's topic. Mr. Wilson, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Max. Good evening, everybody. Guten Abend, grüß Gott. My main job is actually Professor of Ukrainian Studies at University College London, which is mainly politics and history, but I'll be talking about economics this evening. And in my remarks, I aim to do three things. Firstly, to go through the data, the current state of Ukraine's economy and how the West is helping. Secondly, a kind of bigger picture view of the type of economy that might emerge in a possible post-war Ukraine. And thirdly, something about corruption and oligarchs, which in the past Ukraine has been notorious for. And I'll argue that there's good news, that the oligarchy is declining, but that's not the same thing as the disappearance of all types of informal politics. So firstly, the data. This graph shows annual change in GDP since, well, not quite 1991, 1992 is missing, but since Ukrainian independence in 1992. So we'll start by looking at 2022. As you can see, Ukraine took a massive hit, minus 29% fall in GDP in 2022, a year of Russia's full-scale invasion. But it didn't collapse. And if you look at the next few years, it's been slowly recovering. I had a hard time harmonizing some of this data. Some IMF definitions are different to local Kiev numbers. So you might see slightly different figures from different sources. But the economy is growing. All right, it's survived. Its banking system has survived. More severe forms of collapse, like the collapse of the banking system or whatever, haven't happened. But if we look at the kind of longer term picture, I mean, this shows merely 15 post-Soviet states. So even amongst those, let alone compared to more successful neighbors, Ukraine was near the bottom in terms of GDP per capita, the normal measure of standard of living. At the top, you have countries who are EU members with flourishing market economies, the Baltic states, but also some energy states in the middle. Ukraine was at the bottom, down with Moldova and others. And this graph shows that Ukraine in blue back in 1991 had roughly the same GDP per capita as Poland in red. But Poland has grown consistently over the last 2.5 decades. Ukraine hasn't. So an enormous gap has opened up. Poland is seen as one of the success stories of Europe. Ukraine, having been in a roughly similar starting position, is now much poorer. And if we go back to this first graph, we can look at some of the detail why. Ukraine has basically had 5 recessions since independence in 1991. If you look at the left, you can see that throughout the 90s, there was negative growth. In fact, Ukraine's first year of recovery was 2000. Then you have a second recession. Ukraine is hit very hard by global financial crisis, 2009. Then 2014, 2015, it's hit by Russia's annexation of Crimea and fomenting a war in East Ukraine. Then you have a small recession in 2020, that's coronavirus. And then you have the 2022 mega recession of minus 29%. So that's a lot of repeat blows to a pretty fragile economy. If we look at the main current statistics, 2 big problems. The first is a huge fiscal deficit. Expenditure far exceeds revenue. Though, if you look at the blue line, revenue has actually been going up. It's the kind of dramatic increase in expenditures that's the problem. And a second deficit, again, Ukraine has, after a big drop in exports have recovered a little. But Ukraine is having to import so much because its own domestic production capacities are being constantly attacked. So as well as a huge budget deficit, you have a huge trade deficit. Other things aren't so bad. This shows foreign exchange reserves, which even at their minimum never fell below 20 billion US, and are now actually slightly improved, largely because of foreign lending. So the situation with the currency isn't as bad as you might think, but starting in 2022 in this inverted scale, which shows the Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia against the euro, upwards means a fall in the Ukrainian exchange rate. So you see a big fall in 2022 and no real recovery. In fact, periodic constant sliding. 2024, relatively recently in the months of 2025, the currency's been sliding again, which means inflation, currency depreciation, a massive spike in 2022, 2023, but reasonably well contained in recent years, largely because of the strength of the monetary and the banking system, though with that going up again. And the biggest problem in terms of both, mainly in terms of the fiscal deficit, obviously a huge military spend. You can see a pre-invasion diagram showing how Ukrainian state expenditures were divided up, and the 2023 version in purple. Defense spending is 26% of the budget, but also a huge spend on social policy and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. A huge rise in poverty, a huge number of people, including IDPs and so on, that need to be taken care of. rising spending is the burdens, if you like, of maintaining a war economy are obviously at the heart of the problem. So Ukraine has needed outside support, as this graph shows. Government debt, which was very low initially. In fact, it was zero in 1991 when Ukraine became independent, now creeping up towards 100% of GDP. Hardly any of that is met from domestic borrowing in purple. Most of it is external in orange. So Ukraine has these two huge deficits to cope with. The fiscal deficit at about 34 billion. It's actually slightly improved on last year, but is a massive 20% of GDP, and a trade deficit of almost 30 billion last year. How much is the IMF providing? Well, basically 4 billion a year, right? A 16 billion package was agreed in 2023 over 4 years. That's about 4 billion a year. So, as is well known, this isn't really IMF support that's keeping Ukraine alive, but contributions from global community. If you're interested, you can follow this up. Ukraine Support Tracker is an excellent resource produced by the Kiel Institute for the Global Economy. And it shows just which countries are providing most to Ukraine. On the whole, despite Trump's rhetoric, Europe, if you can see there, 156 billion, has provided more. And again, we'll ignore Trump's made-up numbers. 115 billion. Slight trouble moving my slides. Bear with me. On the right there, you can see which countries provide the most as a percentage of GDP. Baltic states, Scandinavian states. It's not shown, but actually Norway, which has hugely benefited from higher oil and gas prices since 2022, has also spent some of that money on assistance to Ukraine. Adding in refugee costs, which are borne mainly by Europe compared to the USA. Again, that shows even more clearly that it's Europe who has provided most in terms of total aid. Though this next graph shows the difference between monies that have been promised or allocated and monies that have actually been dispersed. Again, the US is actually has the biggest difference between the two. So on the headline figure, the US is actually slightly behind because it hasn't spent everything that it promised. That's complicated. What's the bottom line? Well, the IMF recently produced a report saying because of those two twin deficits, budgetary and trade, Ukraine needs about 40 billion a year in external support. And this data in point 2 is from that Kiel Institute again. Their maths, adding everything up from January 2022 to just recently, end of April 2025, total support from Europe, the US, Japan, and Canada, 360 billion. So over 3.5 years, that's roughly 100 billion a year. So that's twice the IMF number. And that's mainly financial. Right? Obviously, there's a lot of military expenditure within that. But your 100 billion figure is supporting Ukraine in the kind of position that it's in now, where it's under a lot of pressure militarily. So the Kiel Institute and others go for a higher figure. If we actually wanted Ukraine to have the advantage in the war, then the annual financial burden would be more like 150 billion, which would be about 12 billion a month. So the West is helping, but not as much as it could be. And even on a kind of narrowly utilitarian calculus, that actually pushes other costs into the long run. Because the West is compensating for Ukraine constantly being hit in the short term and constantly having to rebuild, the current funding model will probably end up costing more in the long run. Second thing I wanted to talk about, what type of economy does Ukraine have or is it heading for? This map shows changes in GDP of the Ukrainian regions due to the war. The south and the east used to be the location of most of Ukrainian heavy industry, steel, chemicals, you name it. And the south used to be the main import and export route through the Black Sea. So what we're seeing is a huge fall in economic activity, obviously in areas occupied by Russia, obviously in frontline areas, but in areas neighboring to the front line as well. So economic activity is increasingly shifting. And if you concentrate on the blue areas where economic activity is actually doing relatively well, into the safe parts of Ukraine, which is basically a corridor. It's the way we travel to Ukraine, in from Poland, via Lviv to Kiev. So that kind of west to center corridor is increasingly where the economic activity is. And that's a Russian war aim, right, to push economic activity out of contested areas. And the same picture can be seen at a human level. So this shows which regions are in receipt of population. So that means that people fleeing the occupied areas or the front line, they initially moved to places like Odessa, to Dnipro, to Kharkiv, to Poltava, but basically constantly moving more towards the center and the west. I mean, Kiev isn't particularly safe at the moment, but until recently, it's been much safer than the rest of Ukraine. Obviously, Russia is trying to make all of Ukraine unsafe at the moment. So as well as economic activity, people are physically shifting more towards central and western Ukraine. And even bigger numbers have left. At one time, 7 million. There has been back and forth. Some have gone to Russia. Some have gone to Russia not particularly voluntarily. Highest numbers are in neighboring countries like Poland. Germany has been very generous. But cumulatively, because Ukraine was losing population before Russia's full-scale invasion as well, your big number is basically that Ukraine has lost about 10 million people in 10 years. And it has this huge IDP burden domestically. And not everybody, a lot of those IDPs can't or aren't working. So if Ukraine needs to restart post-war, it needs at least another 4.5 million people in the workforce, which is as an aside, why Ukraine has been so reluctant to do the logical thing, which is having young people fighting, right? Normally in wars, it's the young who fight. Ukraine had a minimum age of 27, which is then lowered to 25, in order to try and preserve the workforce, full stop, or at least the future workforce. Another point about geography is that for 10 years at least, Ukraine has been shifting its trade patterns. Before the current war, Ukraine traded about a third with Russia, about a third with the European Union, and about a third with the rest of the world. So the share going to Russia is now in single figures. Share going to the EU has gone up. The share going to the Near East and Africa and other parts of developing world is also pretty big. So again, Ukraine needs those trade routes, particularly the southern ones, towards Near and Middle East. There are plenty of positive areas. One, for a long time, has been IT. Ukraine has a very strong IT economy, which was actually boosted by a similarly strong IT economy in Belarus, which at one stage was heading towards 10% of GDP. Since the political crackdown in Belarus in 2020, since Belarus played its part in full-scale invasion 2022, most of those people, well, some have gone to Poland, some have gone to Lithuania, but a huge number have gone to Ukraine too. Defense, obviously. And if you combine the two, Ukraine is actually at the cutting edge of #1 growth industry in Europe over the next 5-10 years, which will be the new defense technologies that we need to meet the target of 5% of GDP spending by NATO members. That's not just more money, but it's the new types of weapons that are on display in Ukraine, drones in particular. Reconstruction is huge, particularly in the energy sector. Ukraine has lost more than half of its original generating capacity. Most of the rest is nuclear. There's a certain restraint in Russia attacking that, ironically. But many of the other large-scale means of electricity generation have gone. But that does mean Ukraine, again, is a global leader in small-scale energy, neighborhood energy production, which again is a huge pan-European growth area, particularly in green areas. So there are plenty of areas where the Ukrainian economy could be a leader, particularly sectorally, but it needs the people and it needs the trade routes. Third thing I wanted to talk about and end on some good news. Ukraine used to be notorious for oligarchy and oligarchy which held back the domestic economy. The productive bits of the economy were taken over by oligarchs and who didn't pay their taxes and held back the rest of the economy. If you look at corruption in general, this is the Transparency International Corruption Index. It's inverted. So as you can see, Ukraine's score has changed from 25 to 35 last year. So that's improvement. It's an inverted scale. The higher your number, the lower your corruption. Most of this is based on what's called a corruption perception index. CPI. It's relatively difficult to measure corruption directly. Asking people if they're corrupt doesn't normally give you honest answers. Um, and when people answer the kind of questions that are asked about their perceptions of corruption, they tend to focus on high-level corruption, oligarchy or whatever. If you ask about people's personal experiences of corruption, then the picture is actually even brighter. People don't report so much having to pay small-scale bribes as they did in the difficult transition years, 90s and noughties. So Ukraine, in terms of corruption, isn't that different to these other candidate countries shown, EU candidate countries. Technically, Turkey is still a candidate country, although it's not really going to join the EU anytime soon. Where did the Ukrainian oligarchy come from? Well, it actually came from two things. This graph shows receipts from the privatization of state-owned assets. So apart from 1 year in 2005, when one single factory was resold, Kryvyi Stahl, a steel mill, it had been sold to two oligarchs for a real low price. As a result of the Orange Revolution, it was resold on the open market at a much higher price. Almost $5 billion was received. So your takeaway is that's how things could have been. Whereas every other year you see just how little was paid for privatized assets. They were all sold incredibly cheap, way at book value, more or less. Price earnings ratio, not much above 1. But the Ukrainian oligarchy was also, less well known, created by Russia. This graph is in Russian, so I'll try and explain it. It's from the paper Novaya Gazeta, new newspaper. Back in 2021, the Russian reads 600 billion was spent by the Kremlin on geopolitics in the last 20 years. And your light blue at the top, I mean, I have translated that for you. Support for regimes. Belarus is 109 billion. Ukraine is 103 billion. So right at the top, Novaya Gazeta's calculation is that 103 billion was spent by Russia in sort of covert subsidies, cheap energy and whatever. So a large part of the Ukrainian oligarchy's fortunes actually came from linkage to Russia. So the number one reason why oligarchy is in decline is that no longer applies. None of these guys are getting money from Russia anymore. This came from a more academic paper I wrote. What it tries to show is that starting off with gas, Ukrainian oligarchs have very successfully shifted from one source of rent enrichment to another. It was originally gas, but after Russia's full-scale invasion in 2015, sorry, first invasion in 2014, Ukraine basically stopped importing Russian gas 2015. Then there are things like procurement. I won't go into the details. Oil. Most recently, Zelensky's road and rail building program called Big Construction. So it's an inverted pyramid. Although the Ukrainian oligarchy has been quite skillful at finding new forms of corruption, they've got smaller and smaller. And there are a lot of stories about corruption in the armed forces, but compared to the massive explosion of defense spending that we talked about at the start, corruption numbers in the defense sector are pretty small. So this graph I've included because it was done by a student of mine. What it shows is the top 100 richest people in Ukraine, so the oligarchs, how their domestic wealth, which is the blue columns at the bottom, has shrunk compared to national wealth, which is the light blue. So just follow the red line, which shows on the right that the share of national wealth held by the 100 richest people has been going down. And that this graph stops in 2017. If we go up to the present day, here are some of Ukraine's richest oligarchs. Right at the top, you have Rinat Akhmetov. So his personal wealth down by almost a third. He is actually from the Donbass. So a lot of his assets have been physically destroyed. Steel mills, energy production. A lot have been deliberately targeted by Russians, the energy infrastructure. Eastern and southern Ukraine, where all the large industry is, has suffered more than the rest of the country in the war. So for all those reasons, you can see Ukrainian billionaires losing wealth. That's in Ukrainian, so I'll skip over that one. But they've also lost political influence. So what this diagram tries to show is how oligarchs have used and abused politics in Ukraine. In the old days, starting at the top, 3/4 of the TV audience in Ukraine was owned by, was on channels owned by oligarchs. All of those people in the past diagram, Akhmetov, Pinchuk, and others, owned their own TV channels. So they used these TV channels to promote their favored parties and politicians. Even Zelensky, when he was first elected, had links to one oligarch, Ihor Kolomoisky. Then at the bottom, all of these Ukrainian words. You get people who fight for your interest in parliament. They're called bayonets. Smotriashchi is a Russian word. It means watchers, people who look after your interests. Kuratori means curators. Pet judges and law firms. In all three branches of state, they look after your interests. So the oligarchy had even more money to keep the cycle going again. Until now. As some of you may know, TV is completely unfashioned in Ukraine. A majority now get their news from social media, partly because all of the big TV channels were corralled into something called the United News Marathon in 2022. It still exists, but it's lost audience. So oligarchs have lost their TV, and there are no elections. They don't have the opportunity to try and restart this cycle by promoting a new set of parties and politicians, which they undoubtedly will try and do at the next elections whenever they occur. And Ukraine passed an anti-oligarch law in 2021. I can go into the details if you want in Q&A. But it basically empowers the executive, the National Security and Defence Council, to name and persecute oligarchs. That's happened a huge amount, starting before the war with pro-Russian oligarchs like Viktor Medvedchuk. Their parties and their TV was closed down. More so since 2022, several companies have been renationalized. Other pro-Russian oligarchs, most recently Vladimir Novinsky, who's the main sponsor of the Russian church in Ukraine, have been sanctioned. So the presidency and the National Security Council are much more powerful. So I was trying to finish on a good note, but I'll qualify that slightly. So oligarchy is a much smaller problem than it used to be. You don't have hugely powerful sharks ready to gobble up any reconstruction money. And as I tried to say in the first third of the talk, Ukraine will need huge amounts of reconstruction money. But a lot of their powers, the powers that oligarchs used to have in controlling other branches of state, in controlling the political system, in controlling media narratives, have now passed to the presidential office. Right? So the big fear is that might be where a new oligarchy incubates itself in the future. But that's present tense, right? There definitely isn't one at the moment. Right? If you've read stories about Zelensky's yacht or whatever, yeah, they're not true. But there are people around him who have enormous informal influence. So in terms of just to summarize the 3 points, firstly, in terms of the data, Ukraine needs a huge amount of money. It's getting an enormous amount, but it needs a huge amount. It needs more than it's getting. Secondly, it needs more people and more trade routes, and it needs peace so those people come back home. And thirdly, it needs to escape the kind of economic model that it had before 2022. Poland isn't perfect, but that's a pretty good model for Ukraine to catch up on and have a more European economy. I hadn't mentioned the EU at all, but that's hugely important. That accession process is hugely important. There's a lot of talk about Ukraine and Moldova being decoupled by the EU. At the moment, they're both heading towards the EU at the same rate. But some people in the EU now think Ukraine is actually more difficult than Moldova because it's at war and it's much bigger. But if Ukraine buries itself in that process too, it will be more like Poland in 5 or 10 years.
Thank you, Andrew, for this in-depth look into this topic, for the many data and graphs you've shown us to illustrate your points. I think it was very illuminative. And of course, thank you for ending on a positive note.
And Max has the PowerPoint, so if anybody wants it, they're welcome to have it.
Yes, of course, I will share with everybody. And so, yes, like I said, thank you for ending on a positive note. I think we can all use some optimism in these times. And thus, I would like to open the floor for questions. We have about 10 to 15 minutes. So if you would like to ask Professor Wilson a question, you can just turn on your mic and pose it or write it in the chat. The floor is open.
I guess I'll start first if you don't mind.
No, of course.
Hello, my name is Ksenia. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. I just wanted to ask if all of the kind of models for recovery of Ukraine are based on the presumption that it will not return for now its occupied territory. So are we considering all of its resources in the current kind of cut territory form, or are we taking into account, are there models that take into account the possibility of Ukraine returning some of its occupied territories from Russia? Thank you.
Should I answer one by one, Max?
No, please answer as you go.
Well, please visit the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. There's a huge amount of very good data. The data that I was quoting de facto is based on the loss of currently occupied territory. Another question is the survivability of economic activity in areas close to the current front line. Whether that economic activity can be preserved. I don't think there's much possibility of economic rescue. There's no physical opportunity of transferring assets from occupied areas. At the moment, Ukraine has been relatively successful in reopening maritime export and import routes in the Western Black Sea. If we call Crimea and its territorial waters also an occupied area, although it's perilous in that adjacent area, there is still export and import. I mean, numbers are quite healthy. Is that stable and sustainable? Yes. Ukraine has more problems on land than it does at sea. Without a navy, it's been able to reopen these trade links. It doesn't have a navy for escort, but commercial shipping is still going back and forth. And it's pushed the Russian Black Sea further to the east. So in that particular adjacent to occupied area, Ukraine has been able to keep economic activity going. But there are all sorts of other threats that Russia can impose, which is basically what it's trying to do at the moment. Make cities like Sumy or Kharkiv lose people and activity.
Thank you.
And we have another question in the chat. Andrea,
Xenia, are you related to my old friend Konstantin Eggert?
Yes, I am his daughter.
I thought so, because I can see pictures of the two of you. If Konstantin's here, hello.
Right. Hello.
Nice to meet you.
I'm actually here, Andrew. Hello.
Hello, Konstantin.
I'm not opening the window for sort of for some reason, but yeah, definitely, and thanks for the presentation.
Lovely to hear.
I can't raise my hand. For some reason, the facility disappeared. Can I ask one question with the permission of Ludmila and Ksenia? And yours, of course.
Go ahead.
Good. I would like to ask you about the something that you mentioned, because when you mentioned the oligarchs and the richest people of Ukraine, how do you think, how do you see this relationship between, let's say, the presidency in Ukraine and the oligarchat today? What changed in this balance? Do you think that the oligarch class is weakened, and especially bear in mind the fact that Poroshenko is not only a former president and potential contender, but also an oligarch? How do you see his role in the current setup?
Is the oligarchical class weakened? Definitely, yes. Which is a huge change, because in the 90s and the noughties, 2010s, there was a lot of talk about persistence, survivability of the oligarchy, and of disappointment after Orange and Revolution dignity. But I think those two events, particularly the Revolution of Dignity, did start off some of this change. But it's been accelerated by the securitization of the state. So oligarchs have, the ones who remain, remain on the terms of the office of the presidency. You know, they have to offer something that's politically useful. Akhmetov has promised basically to stay out of politics for the duration of the war. Pinchuk lobbies, Viktor Pinchuk lobbies Ukraine's interests in the West. So the whip hand is with the office of the president, and Yermak is the head of that office, but it's the people below him, the deputy heads of the presidential office, who are rightly called the curators, kuratori, of more or less everything in Ukraine. Some the legal system, some oligarchs. So those who've survived have basically had to negotiate their survival with the office of the president. And there is this open question about if those, about whether those curatori or curators in the presidential office will be able to convert their political capital into economic capital sometime in the future. At the moment, it's largely political capital. They control the old informal networks rather than the oligarchs. Poroshenko, I mean, one thing that the office of the president is doing is basically cutting down all the tall poppies in advance of possible elections. A lot of political opponents have been targeted using old-style political technology, which hasn't gone away. And Poroshenko has been targeted both as a political opponent and as an oligarch, which is why he is actually on the sanctions list that was introduced this year, supposedly for economic malfeasance. But obviously he's been targeted because he's a political opponent too, if that's an answer to your question.
Thank you, Andrew. I would like to direct your attention to a question in the chat by Elena. And then we have one more question by Elena, and then I think that's our time.
Will Ukraine be able to avoid social polarization during the process of economic reconstruction, considering the regional disparities in the extent of destruction and development? Some of the data that I put up in order to show regional and social polarization. IDPs are at the bottom end of the social scale at the moment. The re-expansion of poverty has been a huge phenomenon. About 40% are now in poverty. A lot of people suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, not just military veterans. A lot of people therefore have extra needs. So social polarization around all of those dimensions is certainly possible. If you look at, we've got a reconstruction conference coming up in Rome. Sadly, they're now annual. But if you look at how they've changed, the first one under our last Conservative government in the UK, in London, went for a very, very neoliberal free market approach as the kind of guiding philosophy behind reconstruction, which is the kind of thing that would make social polarization so much worse. So there's been a kind of walk back from that. It is recognized that the state will have to have a much bigger role, but there are people around Zelensky who call themselves neoliberal. Before Russia's full-scale invasion, they were pushing for a kind of deregulated gig economy, which tends to raise employment, but only by producing very low wage jobs. So I will basically say to you, Olena, yes. All of those types of polarization are a huge possibility in post-war Ukraine, as well as going back to obvious physical issues. In places that have been destroyed, the remaining people will, have few economic opportunities and jobs. They can't all just be in Kiev and Lviv and other safe places.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Elena, your hand is raised.
Yes, hello. I wanted to ask, what do you think, to what extent is corruption in the defense and the military is affecting Ukraine's fighting capabilities?
Well, there was a piece by Adrian Kratnitsky in Foreign Affairs, I think, where he started with the very true point that compared to the scale, compared to the level of increase in defense spending, the level of corruption has not risen at the same rate. There was a famous scandal involving food supply and the price of eggs. This was morally shocking, people overpricing these low price items, but hey, they were eggs. They weren't that expensive. But quite rightly, people are hypersensitive towards any corruption in the armed forces. And that actually destroyed Poroshenko's presidency in 2019, or at least the final nail in the coffin, where there was a scandal of a kind of round tripping scheme where his associates were overcharging for Russia-sourced raw material supplied to the armed forces. Again, not a big amount of money, but on principle, there's zero tolerance for that during wartime. There's also a big issue, and you see this a lot on social media, of more, what do you call it, corruption, lifestyle. If generals, have big houses, if, people in the presidential administration are not sending their sons or daughters to fight, those kind of lifestyle and moral issues, even if they're not directly corruption, that's a very divisive issue too. It will be a huge post-war issue because you have a big, vocal army, veterans, military support, civil society groups, and so on. But part of your question is it bad enough to harm military capacity? In some small cases, yes, but not in any, I don't know, just to pick a random example. In the late Soviet era, there were all sorts of missiles that wouldn't have gone off because people had sold the petrol or whatever. Nothing as bad as that. No mega scandals in terms of defense procurement, some small ones, even in uniforms and so on. So the answer to that particular question, apart from some small exceptions, I would say no, not bad enough to have harmed Ukraine's basic ability to fight.
Thank you. That is very reassuring.
Are you Ukrainian, Elena?
No, I'm Russian.
Ah, okay.
Thank you for your questions. I see there's one more hand up, and I think we have time for one more question, but that has to be really the last question. I would like to stress that point. Anya, please.
Hi.
Hi, Anna.
Yeah, my question is related to the workforce, because you've mentioned that Ukraine needs at least 4.5 million people in the workforce. like what do you think could be a key solution here? Like what should be done, like the development of migration policy, and Ukraine should be ready to receive more migrants? Or is it digitalization? Or what could be the approach here? And is Ukraine doing enough right now, like to ensure the workforce in the long-term perspective, or something else could be done right now?
I mean, your number one answer is security and safety. At the very present moment, Russia is bombing Ukrainian cities, particularly Kiev, with impunity. It's trying to push in the other direction. It's trying to encourage a new wave of outmigration. And the Ukrainians I haven't been to Kiev for 6 months, but the Ukrainians I talk to say things aren't that bad yet, but we're on the cusp of people thinking about it again. So we're a long way from a solution in terms of returnees, though there has been a lot of cyclical back and forth. But opinion polls taken amongst refugees are pretty depressing. They show declining numbers intending to return. You mentioned two other solutions. One, Ukraine is clearly planning on technology leapfrog to have the most high-tech digital economy imaginable. It already had some things before 2022. If it hadn't had DIA, this kind of online app, then citizens wouldn't have been able to securely access state services. They can online. Some more of that, the better, except as always, as always with these kind of cases, it might encourage more people to stay abroad. If they can work from abroad, or their companies are half abroad or whatever. A numerical solution would be migration into Ukraine. That would require A, physical safety, and B, who? Is Ukrainian society prepared to contemplate opening its doors to global migration? We'll leave that as a massive open question. But all of those solutions at the moment have their problems. Return migration, digital working, migrants from other sources. None of them are easy or obvious solutions at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for everybody for actively taking part. Before we wrap up, I wanted to let you know about our upcoming semester. I will now post a link to the info page into the chat. So the overarching topic of this semester will be the regional impact of the New World Order. The course will consist of 16 lectures, much like this one, where we will examine how the global shifts of power are playing out on the regional level, focusing on political, economic, social, and cultural aspects. Furthermore, additional to this theoretical part, we will teach you how to use a forecasting tool, Genie 5.0, with practical hands-on lectures and exercises. Genie 5.0 is a software which enables you to create forecasting models. It will begin on October 15th and last about 6 weeks. Classes will be held in the evenings online via Zoom. So if today's webinar sparked your interest, visit our website to find out more about our school and the upcoming semester. Again, thank you everybody for taking part. Thank you for the interesting questions. And of course, thank you, Professor Wilson, for your very interesting lecture. And
thank you for all the excellent questions.
It's from me. Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a million. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.